Hey viewers, welcome to the channel. If you have a macro that relies on user inputs, then it's a good idea to validate them at the beginning of your macro. So in this example, I've got one that creates a report and I have three parameters that the user needs to input. And if these are blank, then it's a good chance that the macro will return incorrect or invalid results, or perhaps even fail. Now, I've given each one of these cells a named range, which is just an alias for the cell. I call it IN underscore name. So IN for inputs because the worksheet's called inputs. The state is IN underscore state. And the postcode is IN underscore P code. Now you don't need to do this. I prefer to, because if we were to move the cells and you reference them directly in your code, then you would have to change your code. By using named ranges, you don't have to. I do talk about this in my how to reference ranges videos, so please check them out if you haven't already. So this button is going to trigger the create report macro. So Alt F11 to go to VBA and take a look at it. So the way I validate inputs ties in directly with error handling. I do have a two-part video on how to handle errors in VBA. Please check them out if you haven't already, as it's quite important to how this works. But I'll give you a quick overview as we go along. So I have three variables defined here. MSG is going to hold the validation error message or even a runtime error message. The style is going to define the icon and the buttons that appear in the message box. And isValid is true if there are no validation errors and false if there are. Now, as per my error handling videos, the onErrorGoTo, it will tell the compiler that whenever there's a runtime error, jump down to this label that I've created, and I'll get to that in a moment. After that, we have our function validate inputs, and this is going to validate each of those three cells. It's going to return two parameters, the isValid and a message, and then it'll return true or false. So if there is no validation errors, this will be true. If there is one validation error, it'll return false. The message will be blank if there's no runtime errors or validation errors. Otherwise, it will have the validation error or the runtime error. Now, the function will return false only if there's a runtime error. If there's a validation or no validation error, it will return true. So we use the isValid flag to tell us whether there was a validation error or not. So if there's a runtime error, it's going to jump down to that create report error. So let's take a look at this function. So the function takes the two parameters I mentioned above and returns a Boolean. If there's a runtime error in this function, it will jump to validate inputs error label, which is defined further below, and I'll get to in a moment. Then we initialize some variables. As this is a function, we want to default the return value to false. It should do so anyway, but I like to do it just to be sure. So the message we're going to set to null string, which would be the same as if you did equals two double quotes. And set isValid to true. So we're going to assume that it's valid. And then if we find a cell that's not valid, then we'll set it to false. So here we're setting a variable to this cell. It's essentially C4 in the inputs worksheet. Now I've used a code name as an alias to the worksheet, which is the same as if I had done this. Worksheets and inputs dot range and then C4. Okay, but I don't like to hard code the cell names, and I'll talk about this in how to reference ranges videos. So what we do, we set this variable to point to this cell, then check if the value is null string, meaning nothing's been entered, and if that's the case, set the message to this string here. So please specify customer name. And then set the is valid to false. Now, rather than jump to the validate inputs error label, for a validation error, we're going to jump to the exit one. Then repeat the same for the next cell. In this case, it's state or C5. If that one passes, then we check the postcode, which is in C6. Now for each one of these, if any of them fails, we're going to go out. We're only going to check one at a time. All right. If they all pass, then we set is valid to true, although it was defaulted to true anyway, but I like to do that just to be sure, and return true to the function. Validate inputs equals true. So then we fall through to this validate inputs exit. So we get here either via successful validation all the way through, or one of the validations failed and it jumps down to here. So if the validation failed equals a false, we're still going to set validate inputs function to true. Okay. And then we're going to check if that variable is not nothing. We're going to set focus to that one, and that's why I use that variable. This makes this bit of code generic. So rather than specify each one of these dot select to set focus to it, we use that variable, and whatever cell it's pointing to at the time will have focus set to it. And that's just something to help the user. And then it will exit. It will go back to the parent, and it passes back the is valid value and the message. As I mentioned, even if there was validation errors, it would still return true. So it's going to skip this part here and come down to this bit. Here is where we check if there was a validation error or not. So if is valid is false, we had a validation error. I like to set this style to an exclamation icon and then the OK button only. And again, we go to exit label, not the error one. So in this case, let's assume one of the cells was blank. It will come into here. It will set the style. It's already got the message from the validate inputs function. It jumps down to here and displays that message with that icon, and then it finishes. Now, if there was no validation error, no runtime error, it would skip this bit as well. And this is where you would create your report or whatever you're doing with a macro. And then at the very end, if it was all successful, we set a successful message, and I like to use VB information. So that's the information icon. Then it falls through and it displays successful message and that icon. Now, what if there was a runtime error? Let's go down to the validate inputs. Let's say there was an error somewhere along here. So for example, if someone had changed the named range in Excel, they changed the name to something else, the code would fail here. It would jump down to the error label here. We'll set validate inputs to false, and then we'll set the error message to display. Okay, and I append the error number and the description to a message. And then it jumps up to the exit here. Now, is valid will be true in this case because it's defaulted up here at where we initialize it to true. And therefore, it will skip this as well and exit the function and go back up to the parent. So if we go to the parent, validate inputs, it would return false because there's a runtime error. It will go to the create report error, which comes down to here. Now, if the message is blank, it will set this error message, but because we got a runtime error from the child, from that function, it's not going to override it. And that's why we put this, to ensure we don't override that message from the child. And then we set the style. In this case, when it's a runtime error, I like to use the critical icon. Then it goes to the exit label up here and displays the runtime error message and the critical icon. So now let's see this in action. The first one I'll do is a successful. So there's no validation errors, no runtime error. So click on create report. And we get report was successfully created. Okay. Now what I'll do is I'll delete the state and I'll just move focus off that cell. So you see how it will set focus on the state cell. So run it again. And this is the message we get. Please specify state. And you can see the focus is now on state. Click OK. Let me put the state back in and postcode. I'll do the same. And this time it's please specify postcode. And again, focus is set on the postcode. As I mentioned, this will only check one at a time. So if state and postcode were blank, it's only going to mention the first one. So please specify state. Once you enter something here, run it again, it's going to tell you to do the postcode. Now, if you like, you can validate each one and just concatenate each validation message and then return that. I like to do one at a time. All right. Now I'm going to make it fail just so you can see the runtime error. And the way I'll do it, I'm just going to force, won't run this line here. So the range source variable will have nothing in it. And so when I try and check its value here, it's going to fail and it will skip down to the error here. Now what I'll do is I'll actually step through the code so you can see it in action. So I will put a breakpoint here. If you're not familiar with a debugger, please have a look at my how to use a debugger video. It's a very useful tool to learn. All right, so I'll go back to Excel and there's no validation errors, but there will be a runtime error. Click on create report. It stops at the breakpoint and now I can just press F8 to execute line by line. And because range source is nothing, it's going to give me an error and automatically jump down to what we defined here. There's the on error, go to there. So it's going to go to validate inputs error. Here we are. Now it sets validate inputs equal to false. I can press F8 again. All right, the message is blank because we didn't set it. There was no validation error message. So it's going to define this message. All right, so this string, the error number and description. And then it's going to go back up to the inputs exit. Is valid will be true. And so it's going to skip all that, which is good because we don't want to set validate inputs to true in this case. And then exit the function. And as you can see, it comes back to the parent. It was false. And so it's going to go to the create report error. F8 again. Now message is not blank this time because we set it in that function. So we're going to skip this part, which is good. We want to retain the original message. Set the style to critical and then come back up to the exit, and we're going to display the message. And now you should see the runtime error and a critical icon. Here you go. Error validating inputs. Validate inputs function, that's where it occurred, and that's the error number and the description. And click OK, and just F8 and it finishes. So that's pretty much it for validating inputs. I hope you found this useful. If you did, please hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you keep up to date with any new videos. If you got any questions or have any things that you would like to see in future videos, please post it in the comments below. Thank you for watching. We'll see you on the next video.